Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Fort Benning changed everything for me, though not in the way anyone expects when they sign up to serve their country. 6 months ago, I was just another recruit fresh off the bus, 19 and convinced I knew what hard work meant from helping my dad run his construction business since middle school. Basic training would break us down and build us back up, they said. Make us into soldiers, into something stronger than we were before. What they never mentioned was that sometimes the breaking down goes too far, and sometimes the people doing it aren't following any rule book except their own twisted version. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, remembering the sound of boots on concrete at 2 in the morning, knowing what was coming next. Sergeant First Class Hartley had been at Fort Benning for 12 years when our unit arrived that September. Square jaw, perfect posture, the kind of guy whose uniform looked like it had been painted on, never a thread out of place even after 18-hour training days. Everyone respected him immediately, the way you respect someone who clearly knows their job inside and out, and could probably run the obstacle course backwards with their eyes closed. During regular training hours, he was tough but fair, pushing us hard, but always within the boundaries of what the training manual prescribed. He had this way of making you want to impress him, like getting a nod of approval from him meant you were really becoming a soldier. Other drill sergeants would joke around with him in the mess hall, and you could tell even they looked up to him, especially the younger ones who would ask his advice about handling difficult recruits. It started small, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. Private Kowalski dropped his rifle during morning drills, fumbled it right in front of the whole platoon, and Hartley's face went dark in a way I'd never seen before. Not the usual controlled anger drills sergeants use to motivate you, but something colder, more personal. That night, around 11 when most of us were already in our bunks, Hartley appeared in the doorway and called out Kowalski's name, told him to get dressed in full gear and report to the back training grounds behind Building 7. Nobody thought much of it at first. Extra PT for screw-ups was normal, expected even. But Kowalski came back 3 hours later, could barely walk, wouldn't look anyone in the eye, just collapsed into his bunk fully clothed and faced the wall. When someone asked him what happened, he just shook his head and said Hartley was helping him become better, that he needed the correction. After that first night, it became a pattern that spread through our barracks like a disease nobody wanted to name. If you messed up during the day, really messed up in a way that caught Hartley's attention, you could expect that late-night visit. The chosen recruit would get dressed in silence while the rest of us pretended to sleep, though every single one of us was wide awake, listening to the footsteps fade down the hallway. They'd come back hours later, some limping, some holding their ribs, all of them with that same hollow look in their eyes. We started calling them corrective sessions among ourselves, whispered conversations in the shower blocks where we figured the noise of running water would cover our voices. One kid from Alabama, Private Jennings, tried to refuse once, said he was going to report it to the battalion commander, but Hartley just smiled and reminded him that going outside the chain of command was a serious offense, and besides, who would believe a struggling recruit over a decorated sergeant with 12 years of spotless service? My turn came on a Wednesday in October, about 6 weeks into training. During live fire exercises, I'd hesitated before throwing a practice grenade, held it a second too long while my brain processed the weight of what I was doing, and Hartley saw everything. He didn't say anything at the time, just made a note on his clipboard, but I knew what was coming. Sure enough, at exactly midnight, I heard those boots coming down the hall, each step measured and deliberate like he was savoring the anticipation. When he appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting, he didn't even need to say my name. Just pointed at me and then at the door. I got dressed with numb fingers, laced my boots tight, and followed him out into the Georgia night where the air was thick with humidity, and the crickets had gone silent, like even they knew to be afraid. Building 7 sat at the edge of the base, an old warehouse they used for storing equipment that hadn't been updated since Vietnam. Behind it was a dirt clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked any view from the main base. The ground worn smooth from what I now realized were years of these sessions. Hartley had me start with push-ups, nothing unusual there, except he made me do them with my feet elevated on a crate while he placed his boot on my back, adding pressure every time I went down until my arms were shaking so bad I could barely hold myself up. When I finally collapsed, face first into the dirt, he grabbed me by the collar and hauled me up, told me weakness like mine got soldiers killed, got whole units killed, and he was going to fix me whether I liked it or not. For the next 2 hours, he put me through exercises I'd never seen in any manual, making me hold stress positions until my muscles cramped and locked up, bear crawling through the dirt while he kicked at my ribs if I slowed down, standing at attention while he screamed questions in my face about why I thought I deserved to wear the uniform, when I couldn't even throw a grenade properly. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was bad enough that I threw up twice and he made me keep going anyway, told me to swallow it down like a real soldier. It was the way he knew exactly how far to push without leaving marks that would raise questions during morning PT. A bruised rib here, a strained muscle there, nothing that wouldn't look like normal training injuries to anyone who didn't know better. He had it down to a science, probably perfected over years of doing this to recruits who thought they had nowhere else to turn. When he finally let me go, he grabbed my face with one hand, fingers digging into my jaw, and told me this was between us, that I should be grateful he cared enough to give me personal attention when most sergeants would just let me fail. Then he mentioned almost casually that Private Thompson from the previous training cycle had tried to file a complaint once, and wasn't it sad how he'd had that training accident that got him medically discharged before he could graduate. 3 days later, everything changed when Private Nguyen collapsed during one of Hartley's sessions and didn't get back up. We found out later from a guy who worked in medical that Nguyen had suffered kidney damage from dehydration and repeated blunt force trauma to his lower back, though the official report just said heat exhaustion and overexertion during voluntary additional training. They medevaced him out that same night, and by morning his bunk had been stripped and his name removed from all the rosters like he'd never existed. But that's when we started talking to each other for real, comparing notes in hushed conversations during equipment cleaning, and realized this had been going on for years. One recruit remembered his older brother mentioning something about a crazy sergeant at Benning who did special training back in 2016. Another had heard rumors from guys in different units about avoiding Hartley's attention at all costs. What really made my gut churn was when Private Foster, who had a cousin working admin at battalion headquarters, told us what he'd learned during a family day visit. Apparently, Hartley wasn't acting alone, and that was the scariest part of all. There were at least 3 senior officers who knew exactly what was happening behind Building 7, including Major Brennan and Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, and they'd been rotating Hartley between training companies every few years to avoid too many complaints building up in one place. Foster's cousin had seen requisitions for medical supplies that went specifically to Building 7, off-the-book stuff that never appeared in any official inventory, bandages and ice packs and prescription painkillers that Hartley would use to patch up recruits just enough to make it through the next day's training. They had a whole system in place, documented in folders that weren't supposed to exist, tracking which recruits had been through sessions and making sure none of them ended up in the same unit after graduation where they might compare stories. We tried to be smart about it, gathered evidence where we could, took photos of bruises in the latrine mirrors using a contraband phone someone had hidden in the ventilation grate. Private Coleman started writing down dates and times in a notebook he kept inside his pillowcase, documenting who got called out and what condition they came back in. But they were watching us too, and I think Hartley could smell the rebellion brewing in our unit like blood in the water. He started calling multiple recruits at once for sessions, making us watch each other go through the exercises, forcing us to hold each other down or add weight to the stress positions, turning us against ourselves so we couldn't unite against him. One night he had 5 of us out there, And when Private Reese refused to put his knee on Private Gordon's back during push-ups, Hartley made all of us low crawl through the mud for an hour until Reese finally broke and did what he was told, crying the whole time while Gordon gasped underneath him. The breaking point came during week 9 when Private Foster, the one whose cousin worked in admin, decided he'd had enough and went straight to the Criminal Investigation Division office on base. He walked in there with Coleman's notebook, the phone with all our photos, and bruises still fresh on his ribs from the night before. 6 hours later, Foster was gone, transferred to another base for family emergency reasons, and Hartley called a special formation just for our barracks. He stood there in front of us, hands clasped behind his back, and talked about how training accidents were such unfortunate things, how sometimes recruits who couldn't handle the pressure made up stories to avoid facing their own failures. He never mentioned Foster by name, but he didn't have to. We all knew what had happened. That night, nobody got called for a session, but nobody slept either. Just lay there in the dark wondering if we'd ever make it to graduation, or if we'd all end up mysteriously transferred or medically discharged before we could tell anyone what really went on behind Building 7. But Foster had been smarter than any of us realized, because before he went to CID, he'd mailed copies of everything to his father, a retired command sergeant major, who still had connections all the way up the chain. 2 weeks later, the base was suddenly crawling with investigators from outside Fort Benning. People Hartley and his protectors couldn't control or intimidate. They pulled each of us in for interviews one by one, and this time when we talked, people actually listened and wrote things down in official reports that couldn't just disappear. Hartley was relieved of duty pending investigation, and watching him walk off base in civilian clothes instead of his pristine uniform was like watching a demon lose its power. Major Brennan retired quietly a month later. Walsh got transferred to a desk job in Pentagon, where he couldn't hurt anyone, and 3 other sergeants we didn't even know were involved got brought up on charges. The investigation found 17 years' worth of incidents, hundreds of recruits who'd been through those sessions, dozens who'd been seriously injured and silenced. Some of them came forward after hearing about the investigation, guys who were now stationed all over the world but still woke up in cold sweats remembering Building 7. They gave us all medical evaluations and psych assessments, and I spent 6 months in therapy learning how to sleep through the night again without hearing those boots in the hallway. I finished my training with a different unit, became a soldier the right way, the way it was supposed to happen all along. But I still can't walk past a building like that warehouse without feeling my chest get tight and my palms start to sweat, wondering who else is out there using their authority to break people down with nobody watching, nobody stopping them until someone finally finds the courage to speak up. "40 pounds of medical supplies on my back, and I still didn't have enough bandages for what was coming. Forward operating base. Ridgeline had been my home for almost a month, carved into the mountainside like a concrete tumor overlooking 3 villages that hadn't asked for our help. Command called it a humanitarian stabilization effort, which sounded noble enough when you're sitting in an air-conditioned briefing room stateside. Up here, at 8,000 feet, where the wind could strip paint off vehicles and the locals watched us through cracked windows, those words meant something else entirely. 2 years out of medical training at Fort Campbell, and here I was, 24 and playing combat medic in a place where combat was supposedly over. My friends from high school were posting pictures of their new apartments and complaining about their bosses on social media. My boss carried an M4 and had a habit of reviewing casualty reports while cleaning his sidearm. Captain Morrison ran our unit like clockwork, which should have been reassuring but wasn't. Every morning, briefing followed the same script: hearts and minds, building trust, showing the locals we were here to help. He'd stand there with his clipboard, marking off daily objectives like we were running a grocery store instead of an armed outpost. My medical station was supposed to be the crown jewel of our presence here, proof that we brought healing instead of harm. Those first few weeks I actually believed it. Treated mostly respiratory infections in kids whose lungs couldn't handle the dust we kicked up with our vehicles. set broken bones for farmers who'd fallen working their terraced fields, distributed antibiotics like candy on Halloween. Morrison would stop by every evening to review my patient logs, nodding approvingly at the numbers, always reminding me to document everything properly for the reports that went up the chain. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in my 4th week. I was organizing supplies, counting gauze packets for the 3rd time, because the numbers never seemed to match our requisitions, when I heard the commotion outside. 2 of our guys, Corporal Vance and Private Holloway, were hauling someone through the gates. At first, I thought it was one of ours, the way they were supporting him between them. But as they got closer to the medical station's lights, I saw it was a local man, maybe 40. His traditional clothes torn and stained with something dark. They dropped him on my examination table without a word, and Vance just said, "Fix him up, Doc," before walking out. That's when I got my first real look at his injuries. Ligature marks around his wrists, deep enough to leave grooves in the skin, bruising across his ribs in a pattern I recognized from textbooks but had never seen in person, the kind you get from systematic beating with something rigid in uniform, like a baton. The man wouldn't tell me his name, just kept repeating something in Pashto that I didn't understand, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds like he expected someone to come finish what they'd started. His breathing was labored, but not from any respiratory condition. It was fear, pure and simple, the kind that makes your chest tight and your hands tremble. I cleaned and dressed his wounds, documented everything in my official log with the kind of neutral medical language that strips humanity from injury. Contusions, multiple sites, abrasions consistent with restraint, careful not to speculate about cause in writing. While I worked, I noticed other things. His fingernails had dirt packed beneath them like he'd been clawing at something, trying to dig his way out. There was a number written on the back of his hand in black marker, 47, like someone had been keeping track, organizing, systematizing whatever had happened to him. I gave him water and some pain medication, watched him drink with shaky hands that could barely hold the cup steady. After about an hour, when the morphine had taken the edge off his pain, he finally spoke a few words in broken English. "Not fighter," he said, pointing to himself. "Teacher. Just teacher." He pulled out a crumpled ID card from his pocket, the photo showing him clean-shaven and smiling, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in mathematical equations. The contrast between that photo and the broken man on my table made something twist in my gut. Before I could ask him anything else, Sergeant Brooks appeared in the doorway, told me the patient was cleared for release. When I protested that he needed observation, possible x-rays for the rib injuries, Brooks just looked at me with this flat expression and said, Morrison wanted him gone by dawn. The teacher understood enough English to know what that meant. He was on his feet and stumbling toward the door before I could even grab his arm to steady him. That should have been my first warning, the moment I should have started asking real questions, but I told myself it was an isolated incident. Maybe he'd been caught up in something, wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe our guys had made a mistake in the dark. You tell yourself these things because the alternative means accepting that everything you're doing here is a lie. But then Wednesday night came, and they brought in 3 more. Same kinds of injuries, same numbered hands, 48, 49, 50. One was a teenager, couldn't have been older than 16, with electrical burns on his shoulders that formed perfect circles, the kind you get from direct application of current through metal contacts. His uncle was with him, number 49, missing 2 fingernails and with a shoulder that hung wrong, dislocated and left untreated for hours. The third was an elderly woman who wouldn't stop crying, not from pain but from something else, something that had broken inside her that no amount of medical treatment could fix. I was wrapping the teenager's burns when Morrison himself walked into my station, something he rarely did after dark. He stood there watching me work, his hands clasped behind his back like he was inspecting troops on parade. These individuals were detained during routine security operations, he said, using that bureaucratic voice that turned people into paperwork. They've been processed and cleared. Your job is medical treatment, nothing more. I kept my eyes on the gauze I was wrapping. Asked him what kind of security operation leaves electrical burns on a kid who probably wasn't even shaving yet. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath, the gun oil on his uniform. "Specialist," he said, and the way he said my rank made it sound like a threat. "You're here to provide medical assistance. That's your lane. Stay in it." After he left, the teenager grabbed my wrist with his good hand, pulled me down close enough to whisper. His English was better than he'd let on in front of Morrison. "They come at night," he said, words tumbling out fast and desperate. "Take men from houses. Say we hide weapons, hide fighters. We hide nothing. My father, they took him 3 days ago. Number 31, he never came back. His uncle tried to shush him, terrified even in the relative safety of my medical station. But the kid kept talking. They have room in basement, under old school. They take us there, ask questions we cannot answer because we don't know. They write numbers so they know who talked, who didn't talk, who broke." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we didn't do things like that. But the evidence was right there under my hands, burned into his skin in perfect methodical circles. Thursday morning's briefing was like every other, Morrison going through his checklist while the squad leaders nodded along. I sat in the back, my coffee going cold in my hands, watching him discuss supply routes and patrol schedules like we hadn't been torturing civilians in the basement of an abandoned school. When he dismissed us, I followed him to his office, shut the door behind me. "Sir, about the patients coming in at night," I started, but he cut me off with a raised hand. "Those are enemy combatants who've been processed according to protocol," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. I told him about the teacher, the teenager, asked him how a math teacher qualified as an enemy combatant. That's when he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my mouth go dry. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was calculation, like he was solving a problem, and I was a variable that wasn't fitting into his equation. "Specialist," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're a good medic, one of the best we've had up here. Your reports are thorough, your treatment success rate is exceptional, but you're young. You don't understand the complexities of counterinsurgency operations." He pulled out a folder from his desk, thick with papers, and set it between us. "Every individual we detain is identified through intelligence gathering, phone intercepts, human intelligence, pattern analysis. That teacher you're so concerned about, his cousin's neighbor's son joined the militants 6 months ago. The teenager? His uncle's phone number was found in a dead fighter's contacts. These connections run deep, and sometimes we have to apply pressure to find where the threats are hiding." He tapped the folder with his index finger. "This is bigger than your medical station, bigger than this outpost. This is about preventing the next bombing in a marketplace full of families, the next ambush that kills 18-year-old privates from Kansas and Ohio." I left his office knowing 2 things. They weren't going to stop, and I was now a problem that needed solving. That night I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the numbers, about how systematic it all was, how many people had passed through that basement before ending up on my table, or not ending up anywhere at all. Around 0200 hours, I heard vehicles leaving the base, the familiar rumble of Humvees heading down into the valley. I knew what that meant, knew that in a few hours I'd have more numbered hands to bandage, more electrical burns to treat, more broken people to patch up just enough so they could be broken again. I got up, started preparing my supplies, laying out everything I'd need for trauma treatment: gauze, antiseptic, morphine, suture kits. The routine of it was almost comforting, gave my hands something to do while my mind raced through options that all led to the same dead end. By 0400, they were back. This time it was 7 people, numbers 51 through 57, and among them was a kid who couldn't have been more than 12. Number 54. His crime, according to the processing sheet Corporal Vance dropped on my desk, was suspected courier activities. The boy had a concussion, pupils uneven, responding slowly to light, the kind of head trauma you get from being slammed against something hard, repeatedly. While I was checking him for skull fractures, Morrison appeared in the doorway again. But this time he wasn't alone. Master Sergeant Kane was with him, a man who never came to the medical station, who most of us only saw during major operations. Kane had been in Afghanistan since the beginning, had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much and caring too little. "Specialist," Morrison said, his voice different now, colder. "We need to discuss your recent performance evaluations." It was a threat dressed up as bureaucracy, and we all knew it. Kane just stood there, hand resting casually on his sidearm, like we were having a normal conversation at a normal hour with normal people instead of a room full of tortured civilians. "Your rotation ends in 6 days, Morrison continued, checking his watch like the time mattered. "You'll be on the convoy back to Bagram, then stateside for leave. I'm sure you're looking forward to seeing your family, getting back to normal life." The way he emphasized normal made it clear what he meant. Forget what you've seen, keep your mouth shut, move on. Kane shifted slightly, his hand still on his weapon, and I understood the message completely. They had 6 more days to decide if I was going to be a problem that required a more permanent solution. The 12-year-old on my table moaned, trying to sit up, and Morrison's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to me. "Of course, convoy routes can be dangerous. IEDs, ambushes, sometimes people don't make it to Bagram." He let that hang in the air between us, the implicit threat as clear as the numbered hands I was treating. "Do your job, specialist. Treat the patients, file your reports, and in 6 days you go home. That's all you need to focus on." After they left, I finished treating the boy and the others, working in silence while my mind processed what had just happened. They were giving me an out, but it came with conditions. Complicity through silence. 6 days of patching up torture victims. 6 days of pretending not to know what those numbers meant. 6 days of being part of a machine that ground up innocent people and spit out intelligence that probably wasn't even real. The boy's uncle came to help him walk out, and as they left, the man looked back at me with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of justice, just the resigned acceptance of someone who knew this was how the world worked now. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that this wasn't what we were supposed to be, but what good would that do? I kept my mouth shut, cleaned my station, filed my reports with the same sanitized language that turned atrocities into medical procedures. 6 days. I made it through those 6 days by shutting down everything inside me that knew right from wrong, by becoming exactly what Morrison needed me to be, a cog in his machine, silent and efficient. On the morning of day 7, I was on that convoy to Bagram, and 3 weeks later, I was home. I never reported what I saw, never filed complaints, never spoke up. The official records show a successful humanitarian mission, hearts and minds won, medical aid delivered to grateful civilians. Sometimes I Google the names of places near that outpost looking for news, for any sign of what happened after I left. But there's nothing. It's like it never happened at all, except for the numbers I still see when I close my eyes. 31, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51 through 57, and all the ones that came after that are probably still coming. "12 years in the Army, and I walked away right before making staff sergeant, something my old squad still doesn't understand. I let them think what they want, because the real reason isn't something I can explain over beers at the VFW. What happened in that village near the Guatemalan border in early 2018 changed everything about how I see the world. I was 30 then, stationed at a small outpost in southern Mexico as part of a joint task force nobody talks about anymore. We were there, unofficially, helping the Mexican army track cartel movements through the jungle highlands. Most days were boring as hell, sitting in humid tents, monitoring radio chatter, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. The kind of assignment where you count mosquito bites for entertainment and argue about whether the local water would kill you faster than a bullet. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Lieutenant Crawford called 6 of us into the command tent. Intel had picked up unusual activity in a village about 8 miles north, a place the locals called Piedra Negra. Satellite footage showed armed men moving through at night, possibly using it as a way station for moving product north. Crawford wanted eyes on the ground before committing to any larger operation. Simple recon, he said, in and out, 12 hours max. Me, Specialist Miller, Private First Class Dobson, Corporal Ramirez, Sergeant First Class Briggs, and Staff Sergeant Norton would hike in after dark, set up observation posts, and radio back what we found. I remember joking with Miller about finally getting some action after weeks of swatting mosquitoes. If I could go back and grab myself by the shoulders, tell myself to fake sick, break my own leg, anything to avoid that patrol, I would. We left at 2100 hours, moving single file through the jungle with night vision that turned everything into shades of green static. Norton took point, then Briggs, me, Miller, Dobson, and Ramirez bringing up the rear. The humidity was like breathing through wet cloth, and every step squelched in the muddy undergrowth. About 2 hours in, we hit our first waypoint, a ridge overlooking the valley where Piedra Negra sat like a cluster of dark squares against darker forest. Norton hand-signaled for us to spread out and establish our observation posts. I set up with Miller behind a fallen tree trunk, its bark crawling with insects that glowed white in the night vision. Through my scope, I could see cooking fires in the village, maybe 15 structures total. Most of them simple concrete blocks with corrugated metal roofs. At 23:47 hours, Norton's voice crackled through the radio, saying he had movement on the north side of the village. Then Briggs confirmed, counting at least 12 individuals moving between buildings. I was adjusting my scope for a better view when the transmission cut into static. Not unusual in the mountains, but the timing made my neck prickle. Miller tried raising Norton on the backup frequency while I swept my scope across the village. The cooking fires were out now, and I couldn't spot any of the movement Norton had reported, just empty paths between dark buildings. Then Miller grabbed my shoulder, pointed to our 10 o'clock position. Through the trees, maybe 50 meters away, I saw them, 2 figures in tactical gear, moving low and fast toward Dobson's position. The way they moved, the equipment profile, these weren't cartel fighters. These were trained soldiers, and they were wearing our exact same kit. Miller and I exchanged looks through our night vision, that green-tinted moment of recognition that something was deeply wrong. I tried to raise Dobson on the radio, got nothing but dead air. The 2 figures had stopped now, taking cover behind trees, their weapons raised toward Dobson's position. I could see the distinctive outline of M4 carbines, the same weapons we carried. Miller tapped my shoulder twice, our signal for potential friendly fire situation. But these couldn't be friendlies. We were the only American unit operating in this sector, and the Mexican army used different gear entirely. I watched one of them pull something from their vest, and my gut clenched when I recognized the shape of a fragmentation grenade. Before I could key the radio to warn Dobson, the figure hurled it in a perfect arc toward his hide. The explosion lit up my night vision in a blinding white flash. Dobson's scream cut through the jungle for maybe 2 seconds before gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Not random cartel spray and pray, but controlled bursts, disciplined fire patterns I'd heard 1,000 times on the range. Miller was already returning fire while I tried desperately to reach anyone on the radio. Through the chaos, I heard Ramirez yelling in Spanish, then in English, then just screaming. More explosions, more muzzle flashes, but in the strobing light and shadow, I couldn't tell who was shooting at who. Miller pulled me down just as rounds cracked over our heads, splitting bark from the tree we'd been using for cover. I caught a glimpse of another figure sprinting between trees. Same height and build as Norton, same way of carrying his rifle, but Norton's position was 300 meters in the opposite direction. Then I heard Briggs's voice, clear as day, shouting, "Contact left!" Except Briggs's position had gone silent 5 minutes ago. Miller grabbed my vest and yanked me backward into a small depression in the ground, just as another grenade detonated where we'd been seconds before. Mud and vegetation rained down on us. In the ringing aftermath, I heard bootsteps, multiple sets, converging on our position from 3 sides. Miller was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, trying to clear his weapon that had jammed with mud. I peeked over the edge of our hole and saw them clearly for the first time. 6 figures in perfect formation, moving with textbook squad tactics. Under the night vision, I could make out unit patches on their shoulders, the same patches we wore. One turned slightly and I swear I was looking at Ramirez's face, except Ramirez was supposed to be 200 meters behind us. The figure raised his weapon toward our position, and I saw his finger move to the trigger. We ran. No tactical withdrawal, no covering fire, just pure panic-driven flight through the jungle. Branches tore at our gear. Roots sent us stumbling, but we kept moving because the alternative was dying in that green-tinted nightmare. Behind us, voices called out using our own call signs, our own tactical language, but with something wrong in the cadence, like an echo that arrives too soon. I could hear them pursuing, not crashing through the brush like we were, but moving with impossible coordination through terrain that should have slowed anyone down. Miller went down hard, his ankle catching in a root system. When I turned to help him up, he was staring past me with his mouth open. I followed his gaze and saw Norton standing 20 feet away, rifle at low ready. The problem was, I'd just heard Norton's voice on the radio 30 seconds ago, calling for backup from his original position a half-kilometer north. This, Norton smiled, and there was something in that expression that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Miller scrambled to his feet and we bolted in different directions without a word, some primal instinct telling us that staying together meant both dying. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, crashing through undergrowth, sliding down ravines, splashing through streams. Every shadow could have been one of them. Every sound might have been boots behind me. My radio kept crackling with fragments of conversation, my team members calling out positions, requesting support, confirming kills, but the voices overlapped wrong, like multiple people speaking with the same voice at the same time. At one point, I heard my own call sign repeated 3 times in my own voice even though I hadn't keyed the mic. I ripped the radio from my vest and threw it into the jungle. Better to be alone and silent than connected to whatever was happening on those frequencies. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle just rotating without stopping, so I navigated by keeping the slope of the mountain to my left, figuring it would lead me back toward our base eventually. Dawn was breaking when I literally stumbled into a Mexican army patrol near a logging road. I must have looked insane, covered in mud, gear torn, eyes wild, babbling in broken Spanish about American soldiers shooting at American soldiers. They zip-tied my hands at first, thought I might be a deserter or worse. It took 3 hours and a call to our liaison officer before they agreed to drive me back to our outpost. During that ride, bouncing in the back of their truck, I kept checking the faces of the Mexican soldiers, making sure they stayed the same people, that their features didn't shift when I looked away. When we reached the base, Lieutenant Crawford was waiting with 2 MPs. His first question wasn't about the mission or the village. He asked, very specifically, if I had seen any other members of my team return. When I said no, his jaw tightened in a way that told me I wasn't the first survivor to make it back. They put me in isolation for 48 hours. Standard procedure, they said, for personnel returning from compromised operations. But through the tent walls I could hear other voices, other survivors being brought in. Miller arrived 12 hours after me, covered in cuts and speaking in whispers. Ramirez showed up the next morning, missing his gear, and unable to stop talking about seeing himself die. Norton came in last, 36 hours after the mission started, perfectly clean, all his equipment intact, claiming he'd been at his observation post the entire time and didn't understand why everyone had broken radio discipline. The investigators who debriefed us compared our stories like they were trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. Our GPS trackers showed impossible data, team members in multiple locations simultaneously, paths that looped back on themselves, positions that placed us inside solid rock. The satellite footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static during the crucial hours. Shell casings recovered from the area matched our weapons, but ballistics suggested trajectories that would have required shooters to be in physically impossible positions. What haunts me most isn't the official report that classified the whole thing as a blue-on-blue incident caused by equipment failure and environmental factors. It's not even the medical discharge they gave me after I refused to bunk with other soldiers, insisting on sleeping alone with my back to a wall. What keeps me up at night is Miller's question, asked in a whisper during our last conversation before they separated us for good. How do we know which ones of us made it back? Because here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. We lost 6 men on that patrol, but 7 survivors returned to base. The investigators knew it, Crawford knew it, and we knew it. The math didn't work, but everyone was too afraid to say it out loud. They transferred us all to different units within a week, scattered us across different bases, different countries even. I never saw any of them again, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I catch myself in the mirror and wonder if I'm the one who didn't belong, if somewhere out there the real me is still running through that jungle. The Army gave me an honorable discharge and a monthly check to never talk about Piedra Negra, but silence doesn't stop the dreams where I'm shooting at myself in the dark. Captain Mercer just made Major, and 2 more soldiers are in the hospital because of him. My old squad mate called yesterday with the news, and I punched a hole through my apartment wall before I even realized what I was doing. 6 years have passed since Fort Irwin, since Jimmy Vasquez died in that desert, and that psychopath is still out there running training ops like nothing ever happened. I've kept my mouth shut for too long, signed their papers, took their threats seriously when they said my career would be over if I didn't play ball. But hearing about those kids in the hospital brought everything flooding back, and somebody needs to know what really went down that night in the Mojave, before more soldiers end up dead. August 2017 was hotter than Satan's armpit at Fort Irwin, with temperatures hitting 115 during the day and barely dropping below 90 at night. Our unit was there for a month of desert warfare training, mostly navigation drills and patrol exercises that should have been routine for a group of infantry guys who'd already deployed twice. Jimmy Vasquez was 22, this wisecracking kid from El Paso, who somehow managed to keep morale up even when we were all slowly losing our minds from exhaustion and dehydration. He'd enlisted right after his high school graduation in 2013, same year as me, and we'd been tight ever since we ended up in the same platoon at Fort Stewart. Kid had this thing where he'd carry twice the water he needed in his ruck, not because he was worried about himself, but because he knew somebody would run out and he wanted to be ready to help. That particular Monday started wrong from the jump when Mercer showed up to morning formation wearing his full combat gear in that heat, expecting us to be impressed or intimidated or some combination of both. He had this way of standing with his chest pushed out and his jaw clenched, like he was posing for a recruiting poster, except his eyes were always moving, always calculating who he could push and how far. First Sergeant Blackwood stood behind him looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and I remember thinking something was up because Blackwood was old school, the kind of NCO who'd been in since Desert Storm, and usually didn't let officers pull stupid stunts without at least trying to talk them down. But Mercer had everyone walking on eggshells after what happened to Staff Sergeant Novak the week before, when he'd questioned why we were doing land nav at noon instead of starting before dawn like the training schedule originally said, and suddenly found himself transferred to some supply unit in Kentucky within 72 hours. Mercer announced we'd be doing a 20-kilometer movement to our night navigation point, full combat load, no resupply until we reached the objective. The weather report had heat warnings all week, saying to avoid strenuous outdoor activity between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., but there was Mercer at 11:30 in the morning, telling us to gear up while the sun turned the sand into a frying pan. Jimmy raised his hand during the briefing, asked if we could at least take extra water since we'd be moving through the hottest part of the day, and Mercer's face went from its normal shade of sunburned pink to this deep purple color. He walked right up to Jimmy, close enough that their noses almost touched, and said real quiet but loud enough for everyone to hear that Maybe Vasquez needed to spend some time thinking about whether he had what it took to be a warrior, or if he should transfer to the Air Force where they had air conditioning. After the briefing, Mercer pulled Jimmy aside and told him since he was so concerned about water, he could carry the squad's radio too, an extra 25 pounds of equipment in that heat. I watched Jimmy's face when he got that news, saw him bite down on his bottom lip the way he did when he was trying not to say something that would get him in deeper trouble. Specialist Carson tried to volunteer to take the radio instead, said he was the RTO anyway, so it made sense. But Mercer shut him down with a look that could have peeled paint. We all knew what was happening because we'd seen it before with other guys who'd questioned Mercer's decisions. This systematic breaking down of anyone who didn't worship the ground he walked on. Except this time, we were about to march into the desert during the worst heat of the summer with a pissed-off captain looking to prove a point. We stepped off at noon sharp, the sun directly overhead turning our helmets into little ovens that cooked our brains while we walked. Within the first hour, 3 guys had already fallen back to the rear of the formation, their faces red as tomatoes, and their uniforms soaked through with sweat that dried into white salt stains before it could even drip off. Jimmy was up front with Mercer, carrying his regular kit plus that radio, and I could see him adjusting the straps every few minutes, trying to find a position that didn't cut off circulation to his arms. The sand was so hot it melted the soles of our boots where the glue held them together, and every step felt like walking through an oven that someone had filled with quicksand. Mercer kept increasing the pace, calling out cadence like we were on some motivational run back at Garrison, instead of a death march through the Mojave. And when Private First Class Hendricks stumbled and went down to one knee, Mercer made the whole platoon do 50 push-ups right there in the sand, while screaming about how weakness was contagious. By hour 3, Jimmy had stopped talking completely, which should have been everyone's first warning sign because that kid never shut up. Always had some joke or story to keep spirits up even in the worst conditions. His face had gone from red to this weird grayish color, and he was swaying with each step like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line. I tried to catch up to him, wanted to take that radio off his back or at least give him some of my water, but Mercer kept me in my position, said any more disruptions to the formation would result in Article 15s for everyone involved. Specialist Washington whispered to me that he'd seen Jimmy dump out his last water bottle an hour ago, completely empty, and now he was just gutting it out on pure willpower and fear of what Mercer would do if he fell out of formation. The sun was starting to set when it happened, that golden hour light making everything look peaceful and beautiful, like some kind of sick joke while we were all dying inside. Jimmy took 3 more steps, then his legs just gave out like someone had cut his strings, and he went down hard, face first into the sand with all that gear on top of him. The radio made this awful crunching sound when he hit, and for a second nobody moved because Mercer had trained us so well not to break formation without permission. Then training kicked in, and me and Carson rushed to flip him over, get his helmet off, start checking his vitals while someone else called for the medic on their radio. Jimmy's eyes were rolled back in his head. His skin was dry and burning hot to the touch. No sweat at all, which meant his body had completely given up trying to cool itself down. And when I tried to find a pulse, it was going so fast, it felt like a hummingbird trapped under his skin. Mercer stood over us while we worked on Jimmy. Not helping, not calling for faster medical support, just watching with this expression on his face that I'll never forget, like he was disappointed Jimmy had proven him right about being weak. He actually said, and I quote this word for word because it's burned into my memory, that this was what happened when soldiers didn't maintain proper physical fitness standards and tried to take shortcuts. Carson looked up at him with pure hatred in his eyes and said, "Sir, Vasquez ran a perfect PFT last month, 300 score, and Mercer just shrugged and said heat casualties were usually pre-existing conditions that the Army didn't catch during recruitment." The medic was still nowhere to be seen, and when Washington tried calling again, we found out they were positioned at the finish point, 20 minutes away by vehicle on rough terrain, because Mercer hadn't wanted them slowing down the movement by being embedded with us. We tried everything we knew from our combat lifesaver training while waiting for that medic. poured what little water we had left on Jimmy's neck and armpits, elevated his legs, fanned him with anything we could find. But his body was too far gone into heat stroke. His breathing got shallower and shallower, these tiny little gasps like a fish out of water, and then it just stopped altogether right as we heard the medical vehicle's engine in the distance. Carson started chest compressions immediately, while I gave rescue breaths, counting out loud to keep rhythm, but Jimmy's lips were already turning blue despite the heat, and his pupils were fixed and dilated when I checked them with my flashlight. The medics took over when they arrived, shot him full of drugs and continued CPR all the way to the medical station. But we all knew he was gone, had been gone probably since before they even got there, killed by one man's ego and need to prove his authority. They pronounced Jimmy dead at the medical station 45 minutes later. Official cause listed as heat stroke, with complications from a previously undiagnosed heart condition, which was complete bullshit because Jimmy had just passed his physical 2 months before with flying colors. Within hours, Criminal Investigation Division showed up, but not to investigate Mercer, no. They came to interview us about whether Vasquez had been drinking the night before, if he'd been taking any supplements, if maybe he'd been hiding some medical issue from the command. Mercer had already gotten his story straight with the battalion commander, painted this picture of a young soldier who'd pushed himself beyond his limits despite repeated warnings to hydrate and rest, completely reversing what actually happened. When me and Carson tried to tell them about the punishment with the extra gear, about Mercer refusing to let anyone help Jimmy when he was struggling, about the medics being deliberately positioned too far away, we got pulled aside by First Sergeant Blackwood, who told us in very clear terms that our version of events didn't match the official report, and maybe we were suffering from heat exhaustion ourselves, confused about what we remembered. They shipped Jimmy's body home to El Paso in a flag-draped coffin, told his mother her son was a hero who died serving his country, never mentioned that his death was completely preventable, that he'd been targeted and punished for having the audacity to ask for extra water in 115-degree heat. Most of us from the platoon pooled money to send flowers to the funeral, but we weren't allowed to attend because we were still in training, still under Mercer's command for another 2 weeks of hell, where he made sure to remind us daily that weak soldiers got themselves killed. 3 guys went AWOL after that, just disappeared into the desert one night rather than spend another day under that monster's command, and honestly, I understood why. The rest of us kept our heads down, graduated the training, and scattered to different units as fast as we could, but not before Mercer made sure our evaluation reports mentioned we had difficulty performing under stress and questioned leadership decisions, career-killing bullets that followed most of us for years. I got out in 2022 after my second contract ended. Couldn't stomach the idea of staying in an organization that protected people like Mercer, while good kids like Jimmy got buried with lies. Carson left a year before me, works construction now in Colorado. Still has nightmares about that day according to his wife who reached out to me on Facebook last Christmas. Washington stayed in, but transferred to the National Guard. Said he couldn't do active duty anymore after what happened. We tried one more time to get someone to listen in 2019 when a senator's office was investigating training deaths. Sent them everything we had, including photos we'd taken that day showing the conditions, the timeline, even a recording Washington had made on his phone of Mercer, berating Jimmy during the march. But nothing came of it because Mercer had connections, golf buddies with stars on their shoulders, who made sure his record stayed clean. Now he's Major Mercer, probably on track to make Lieutenant Colonel within a few years, still running soldiers into the ground in Nevada, and all I can do is post this story on every military forum I can find, hoping maybe someone with more power than me will finally do something. Jimmy's mom still texts me on his birthday every year, tells me about his sisters who all graduated college now, how proud he would have been of them, and every time I have to swallow the guilt of not doing more, not pushing harder, not finding some way to get justice for her son. But maybe if enough people read this, if enough people know what really happened to Private First Class James Vasquez on August 14, 2017, Maybe the next kid who questions an illegal order in dangerous conditions won't end up in a box, and maybe someday Mercer will finally face consequences for what he did, though I'm not holding my breath because the system protects its own, always has, always will. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 12 hours under a Humvee in the middle of winter, and that night, I had it bad. I'm a specialist in the Army, stationed out west, and I'd been pulling double shifts at the motor pool ever since my deployment orders came through. My 26th birthday had passed 3 weeks earlier, celebrated with a gas station sandwich between vehicle inspections, and I was still grinding through the pre-deployment checklist that seemed to grow longer every day. That particular Friday in March 2023, I didn't leave post until 11:15, my hands raw from handling frozen metal all day, and my back screaming from being twisted into positions the human spine was never meant to hold. The drive home took me along Route 115, this desolate stretch of two-lane highway that cuts through about 40 miles of absolutely nothing. Most nights I'd have music going or a podcast to keep my brain engaged, but my phone had died around hour 10 of my shift, and I'd left my car charger in my other vehicle, so it was just me in the road, with maybe 3 or 4 cars passing the entire trip. The highway dips and curves through these rolling plains where you can go 10 miles without seeing a single light, and about 20 miles from post, right where the terrain drops into this wide valley, the fatigue hit me like a brick. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached, and I caught myself drifting across the center line twice in 5 minutes. When I spotted the gravel turnout ahead, just this little semicircle of packed dirt off the shoulder, I knew I needed to stop before I wrapped my car around a guardrail. I pulled in and killed the engine, letting my head fall back against the seat. The silence was immediate and total, the kind you only get in the middle of nowhere with no wind and no traffic. I set a timer on my watch for 15 minutes, figuring that would be enough to reset my brain without falling into actual sleep. My water bottle was in the back seat, still half full from that morning, and the first sip of it was warm and plastic tasting, but I didn't care. I rolled down the window a crack to let some cold air in, and that's when I realized how completely alone I was out there. No houses, no lights, nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. It should have been peaceful, but something about the emptiness made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just the fatigue making me jumpy. I'd been sitting there maybe 5 minutes, eyes closed but not quite sleeping, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My eyes snapped open and I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see another car pulling in to do the same thing I was doing. But what I saw made my gut tighten. A dark sedan, maybe a Chevy or Ford, had parked about 30 feet behind me at an angle, nose pointed toward the highway like it was ready to leave quickly. The headlights were off, completely off. And whoever was inside wasn't getting out or doing anything, just sitting there in the darkness. I sat up straighter, suddenly very awake, and watched the mirror. The car didn't move. Nobody emerged. It just sat there, this black shape barely visible against the night sky, and every instinct I had started screaming that this wasn't right. I reached for my phone before remembering it was dead, which sent a fresh wave of anxiety through my chest. My keys were still in the ignition, and I slowly wrapped my fingers around them without making any sudden movements. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone else who needed a break. Or maybe they were lost and checking a map. But then why park so far back? Why keep the lights off? I kept my eyes on the mirror, barely breathing, and counted the seconds. 30 passed, then 60. The car still didn't move, and I couldn't see anyone inside because the windows were too dark. My training kicked in enough to make me assess the situation logically. One exit, blocked by the sedan. Open terrain on both sides, but my little Nissan sedan wasn't exactly built for off-roading through desert scrub. And if I started my engine now, whoever was back there would know I was spooked. Then the driver's door opened. I watched a figure step out, backlit by the dome light for just a second before it went dark again. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looked like jeans and a dark jacket, civilian clothes. The person closed the door quietly, too quietly, like they didn't want to make noise, and started walking toward my car. Not in a hurry, just this steady, purposeful walk that made my heart start hammering against my ribs. I sat perfectly still, my right hand still on my keys, my left reaching down to make sure my door was locked. It was. The figure kept coming, and as they got closer I could make out more details in my side mirror. White guy, maybe in his 40s, with short hair and a square jaw. Something about the way he moved was too controlled, too deliberate. When he got within 10 feet of my driver's side window, he raised his hand and knocked on the glass. 3 sharp raps that made me jump despite trying to stay calm. I cracked the window maybe an inch, just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach through. "Can I help you?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I was grateful for that. The man leaned down slightly, and in the dim glow from my dashboard, I could see his face clearly now. Clean-shaven, hard eyes, the kind of expression that gave away nothing. "Military police," he said, his tone flat and official. "Need to see your identification and registration." My brain stuttered for a second. Military police, out here, in civilian clothes, in an unmarked car with the lights off? Nothing about this made sense. Real MPs drove marked vehicles, wore uniforms, or at least had visible badges, and they sure as hell didn't lurk in highway turnouts at midnight waiting for random soldiers. "Can I see your credentials?" I asked, keeping my voice level but firm. I'd been stopped by actual MPs before, and they always showed ID first. The man straightened up, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "Wait here," he said, then turned and started walking back toward his car. But he didn't walk like someone going to get identification. He walked like someone who'd just had their bluff called. My pulse was racing now, and I watched him in the mirror as he got about halfway back to the sedan. Then he stopped, pulled something from his pocket that looked like a phone, and appeared to be texting or calling someone. That's when I saw the headlights. A second vehicle, a large SUV or truck, came rolling up the highway with its high beams off, just running lights, and it slowed down as it approached the turnout. My entire body went cold. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. The SUV pulled in behind the sedan, completely blocking the only exit back onto the highway, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was in serious danger. I didn't wait to see who got out of the second vehicle. My hand twisted the key and the engine roared to life, way too loud in the silent night. The man who'd knocked on my window spun around and started running back toward me, yelling something I couldn't hear over the blood pounding in my ears. I yanked the wheel hard to the right toward the open desert and stomped on the gas. My car lurched forward, tires spinning in the gravel before catching, and I went straight off the edge of the turnout into the scrub brush. The suspension screamed as I hit the uneven ground, sagebrush scraping the undercarriage with sounds like nails on metal. My headlights bounced wildly, illuminating nothing but dirt and rocks and scattered vegetation. Behind me, I could see lights now. Both vehicles had their high beams on, and at least one of them was trying to follow me into the brush. But my car was smaller, lighter, and I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. I kept the gas pedal floored, steering around the bigger rocks and praying I didn't hit a drainage ditch or blow a tire. The terrain sloped upwards slightly, and my little sedan struggled, engine whining, but I kept pushing it. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, I saw the highway again, the northbound lane about 50 yards ahead. I aimed for it, crashed through a final stretch of low brush, and my tires hit pavement with a screech that probably took years off the rubber. I didn't slow down. I merged onto the highway going 60 and kept accelerating, checking my rear view obsessively. The lights behind me had stopped at the edge of the brush. They weren't following onto the road. I drove for another 10 miles before my hands started shaking so badly I had to pull into a gas station just to breathe. The attendant inside looked at me like I'd seen a ghost, which I guess wasn't far from the truth. I borrowed his phone and called the local police. Told them everything while sitting under the fluorescent lights with a bottle of water I couldn't even open because my hands wouldn't work right. The dispatcher took my information, told me a unit would meet me there and asked if I needed medical attention. I said no, but honestly, I wasn't sure. 2 sheriff's deputies showed up 20 minutes later and I walked them through the whole thing again. They took notes, asked good questions, seemed to take it seriously. One of them mentioned they'd had reports of suspicious activity along that stretch of highway, people getting followed or hassled, but nothing quite like what I described. They offered to escort me home, which I accepted without hesitation. I filed a formal report the next morning at the station, gave them every detail I could remember about the sedan and the SUV, though I hadn't caught any plate numbers in the chaos. What happened next is the part that still keeps me up sometimes. 2 days later, a detective called me. They'd found a burned-out vehicle at that exact turnout, completely torched, nothing left but a blackened frame and melted metal. The fire department had responded to it Sunday morning after a trucker reported smoke. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found military gear in the trunk, stuff that had survived the fire enough to be identifiable. Tactical vests, what looked like parts of uniforms, equipment that absolutely should not have been in some random civilian's car. The detective said they were treating it as connected to my incident, possibly part of a theft ring targeting military personnel or installations. He told me I'd made the right call running, that these people were clearly professionals who knew what they were doing. They never caught whoever was driving those vehicles, and I never found out if that gear was stolen from Post or from someone like me. The case went cold after a few months. I take a different route home now, even though it adds 15 minutes to the drive. I never stop on highways anymore, no matter how tired I get, and I keep my phone charged religiously. Sometimes I think about how close I came to rolling down that window further, or waiting longer before running, or any number of small decisions that could have changed everything. The detective told me that whoever they were, they'd clearly done this before, that the coordinated approach and the fake MP angle suggested experience. What bothers me most isn't even the danger I was in, though that's bad enough. It's knowing they're still out there somewhere, maybe still working that same stretch of road, maybe targeting other soldiers who are too tired or trusting to question things. I reported every detail I could remember to both the local police and my chain of command. Even sat down with CID investigators who wanted to know if I'd noticed anything suspicious on Post in the weeks before. They seemed to think these people had inside knowledge, knew schedules or patterns. I deployed 4 months after all this happened, and honestly, being overseas felt safer than driving that highway. When I got back stateside last year, the first thing I did was check if there'd been any updates on the case. There hadn't been. No arrests, no new leads, just my statement and that burned car sitting in an evidence lot somewhere. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd been too exhausted to question that fake badge, or if my car hadn't made it through that terrain. Some nights I wake up hearing those 3 sharp knocks on glass, and I have to remind myself I made it out. Not everyone might have been that lucky. Someone asked me to share what happened during my time at Fort Hood, and honestly, I still get this weird feeling in my chest when I think about it. I'd been working as a logistics coordinator for about 18 months when this all went down. One of those jobs where you're basically shuffling supplies and paperwork while pretending the coffee hasn't gone cold for the 3rd time that shift. The apartment complex where I lived sat about 2 miles from the main gate, one of those places that catered specifically to enlisted folks who wanted to get away from the barracks but couldn't afford anything fancy. My unit was on the 2nd floor, number 214, facing the parking lot where I could see my beat-up Mazda from the kitchen window. The place had that generic rental smell, like industrial carpet cleaner mixed with whoever lived there before, but it was mine, and I'd made it comfortable with some plants and posters that made the beige walls less depressing. The first time I noticed something wrong was on a Wednesday in late January. I just finished a graveyard shift that had me processing inventory reports until my eyes felt like sandpaper, and when I trudged up the stairs to my apartment around 7 in the morning, I could have sworn the door wasn't quite flush with the frame. Not wide open or anything obvious, just that tiny gap where you could see a sliver of darkness inside instead of the door sitting properly in its frame. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, my work bag hanging off one shoulder, trying to remember if I'd been in such a rush the night before that I hadn't pulled it shut completely. The lock had clicked when I left. I was pretty sure of that, but exhaustion has a way of making you doubt your own memory. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find my stuff ransacked or my cat freaking out, but everything looked exactly how I'd left it. The dishes were still in the sink, my boots by the door, the throw blanket on the couch in the same wrinkled heap. I checked every room, every closet, even looked under the bed like some paranoid kid. But there was nothing. No broken windows, no missing valuables, nothing that would explain why my door hadn't been properly closed. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just tired and seeing problems where there weren't any. But then it happened again the following week. Same scenario. Night shift. Came home to find that same tiny gap between the door and frame, like someone had pulled it almost closed but not quite hard enough for the latch to catch. This time I was sure I'd locked it properly because I specifically remembered jiggling the handle twice before heading to my car, something I'd started doing after the first incident. My neighbor across the hall, this guy named Kevin who worked in transportation, was getting his newspaper when I came up the stairs. He gave me this casual wave and I almost asked him if he'd seen anyone near my door, but the words felt stupid in my mouth. What was I going to say, that my door wasn't closing right? That I thought someone might be coming into my apartment but leaving everything exactly as it was? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, like the plot of some bad thriller where the woman is just being hysterical. But here's the thing that really got under my skin. I started noticing these tiny differences that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. My bathroom towel would be hanging slightly crooked when I was obsessive about keeping it straight. The chair at my kitchen table would be pulled out a few inches when I always pushed it in. One morning I found my bedroom closet door open maybe 6 inches, and I never left it open because the squeaky hinge annoyed me. These weren't big disruptions, nothing you could point to and say definitively that someone had been there, but they were enough to make me feel like my space was being violated in some subtle, creeping way. I started taking pictures of my apartment before I left for work, stupid little snapshots of how I arranged things, just so I could compare when I got back. My coworker Dana thought I was losing it when I mentioned feeling weird about my place, said maybe the cleaning staff had a key and was coming in without telling me. Except we didn't have cleaning staff at that complex, and I sure as hell wasn't paying for any service like that. The 3rd week of February, I decided to do something about it instead of just sitting there feeling creeped out. I went down to the apartment office and talked to the property manager, this older woman named Diane, who had that permanent look of someone dealing with complaints all day. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, tried not to sound like I was accusing anyone of anything, just said I was concerned about my lock maybe being faulty. She pulled up my file on her computer, tapping her nails on the desk while she scrolled, and told me that my unit had been keyed with a digital access system that was supposedly more secure than traditional locks. Each resident got a key card that was programmed specifically for their unit, and the system kept a log of every entry. She said if I was really worried, she could request the access logs from the past month, but it would take a few days to pull together. I told her yes, absolutely. I wanted to see those logs. Something in my voice must have convinced her I wasn't just being paranoid, because she made a note in her computer and said she'd have them by the end of the week. Those next few days were torture. I couldn't focus at work, kept checking my phone every 10 minutes like the logs were going to magically appear in my email. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked from the inside, even though that felt insane, because who locks their bedroom door in their own apartment? But I couldn't shake this feeling that someone had been in my space, touching my things, standing in my kitchen while I was gone. I even bought one of those cheap doorstop alarms from the store on base, the kind that screams if someone tries to open the door while you're inside. My cat absolutely hated the thing, nearly gave herself a heart attack the first time she brushed against it, and set it off. When Friday finally rolled around, I practically ran to the office during my lunch break. Diane had the printout waiting for me in a manila folder, and the look on her face told me she'd already read through it. She slid it across the desk and said there were some entries that didn't match up with when I said I was home, and that she'd already contacted the main office about it. I opened that folder right there at her desk, and my hands were shaking so bad the pages rattled. The log showed my keycard entries, all the times I'd come and gone, which matched up with my memory perfectly. But there were other entries too, marked with a different card number, happening in the early morning hours when I was at work. Someone had accessed my apartment 7 times over the past month. 7 times. Always between 3 and 5 in the morning. Always when they somehow knew I wouldn't be there. The entries were time-stamped down to the minute. February 2nd at 4:18 in the morning, stayed for 42 minutes. February 9th at 3:30, stayed for an hour and 12 minutes. The most recent one was just 3 days ago. I felt this wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might throw up right there on Diane's desk. Someone had been in my home, in my bedroom, going through my things while I was working night shift. The violation of it made my skin feel wrong, like I needed to peel it off and start over. Diane called the police right then, didn't even ask if I wanted to file a report, just picked up her phone and dialed. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes. A younger guy and an older woman who had this no-nonsense attitude that actually made me feel a little better. They took my statement, photographed the access logs, and explained that they'd need to pull security footage from the complex's cameras. The property had cameras in the parking lot and near the main entrance, supposedly for resident safety, though I'd never paid much attention to them before. The female officer, her name tag said Phillips, told me they'd also need to figure out whose keycard was being used to access my unit. Each card had a unique identifier in the system, so it wasn't anonymous. Someone specific had that card, and the system would tell them exactly who it had been issued to. She asked me if I had any ex-boyfriends or anyone who might have a reason to want access to my place, and I told her no, nobody like that. I'd been single for over a year and kept mostly to myself outside of work. It took them 3 days to trace the keycard, and those were the longest 3 days of my life. I stayed with Dana during that time, sleeping on her couch because there was no way in hell I was going back to my apartment alone. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. The police had advised me not to change my routine too drastically because they wanted to see if the person would try to access the unit again, maybe catch him on camera or even in the act, but I couldn't stomach the idea of being bait. When Officer Phillips finally called me, her voice had this edge to it that made my chest tighten before she even said anything. The keycard belonged to a guy named Adrian Sutton, former Army specialist who'd been discharged 2 years prior. He'd lived in my exact apartment, Unit 214, from 2013 to 2015 before moving off to some other assignment. When he'd left, he was supposed to turn in his keycard to the office, standard procedure, but apparently he'd reported it lost, and they'd just deactivated it in the system and issued him a replacement for the checkout process. Except the deactivation never actually went through. Some kind of clerical error, a box that didn't get checked in the computer, and his old card stayed active in the system all this time. The security footage was worse than I could have imagined. The officers showed me clips on a laptop at the station, and I had to watch this man, this complete stranger, walking up to my building in regular jeans and a jacket like he belonged there. He knew exactly where the cameras were positioned because he'd lived there, so he kept his head down, ball cap pulled low, but they got enough of his face to confirm it was Sutton. The footage showed him swiping the card at my door, glancing around once to make sure no one was in the hallway, then slipping inside. He stayed in there for over an hour on the clip they showed me. When he came out, he was carrying nothing, hands in his pockets, casual as anything. Officer Phillips explained that they'd already been to his current address, a rental house about 15 miles away, and when they searched the place, they found items belonging to 3 other women: jewelry, clothing, photographs, even a journal that wasn't his. Turns out I wasn't his only victim. He'd been doing this to multiple women in different apartment complexes around the base, all places where he'd previously lived or had some connection to. He had a whole system, kept spreadsheets on his computer tracking which units he could access, and when the residents worked night shifts, they arrested him that same day, charged him with multiple counts of burglary, stalking, and trespassing. The detective assigned to the case told me that Sutton had been exploiting security gaps in the housing system for at least 18 months, maybe longer. He'd figured out that when people moved out of base housing, the deactivation process wasn't always followed through properly, especially in older apartment complexes with outdated management software. He'd test old key cards periodically to see which ones still worked. Then he'd research who lived in those units now, figure out their schedules through social media or just by watching the parking lot. The whole thing was so calculated and predatory that it made me feel sick. What really got me was that he'd taken almost nothing from my apartment. A few photos from my phone that I'd printed out and kept on my fridge, one of my old PT shirts that I thought I'd just misplaced. He wasn't robbing people in the traditional sense. He was collecting pieces of their lives, souvenirs, like we were trophies or something. Officer Phillips said he'd probably been building up to something worse, that stalkers like him usually escalate over time. The apartment complex terminated my lease without penalty and helped me move to a different unit in another building, one with a completely new key card system and updated locks. They also had to notify every single resident about the security breach and reissue all the key cards in the entire complex, which caused this massive headache for everyone, but was absolutely necessary. Sutton ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial, got sentenced to 6 years in prison plus probation, and a restraining order against all his victims. I had to go to court twice, once for the preliminary hearing and once for sentencing, and seeing him sitting there in an orange jumpsuit with this blank expression on his face made me realize he didn't even see us as real people. We were just accessible, just targets. I still live near Fort Hood, different complex now, but I check my door 3 times before I leave, and I have a security camera inside my apartment that sends alerts to my phone. Some people think I'm paranoid, but they weren't the ones who had a stranger spending hours in their bedroom going through their things. Dana tells me I should move somewhere completely different, start fresh, but honestly, I refuse to let that creep run me out of my life. I earned my place here and he's the one locked up, not me. When I started volunteering for the Veterans Oral History Project, I thought it would be mostly paperwork and camera setups. I wasn't a historian, just a part-time technician helping record interviews for the archive. The goal was simple: capture the stories of service members before time, and silence swallowed them. Most sessions went the same way: polite introductions, some nervous laughter, and long pauses between memories. Then one afternoon, they sent me the file of a man named Elliot Marsh. His record showed a clean discharge and a few commendations. Nothing unusual. He arrived exactly on time, dressed neatly, his posture too rigid for someone who'd been out of uniform for years. He spoke softly but carried that kind of discipline you don't unlearn. At first, it was standard stuff: base life, desert heat, patrols that blurred together. His words came steady, measured, the kind of rhythm you get when you've told the same stories to family gatherings. But about 20 minutes in, something in his voice changed, a hesitation that didn't match the rest. He glanced toward the camera light, then at me, and asked if the recording was secure. I told him yes, standard digital capture, local backup, nothing special. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. Then, out of nowhere, he said there was one mission that never made it into any report. His expression tightened, and he pressed his palms flat on the table as if steadying himself. "They told us it was a rescue," he said, "but that's not what it turned into." The air in the room shifted after that. He described a night operation deep in an unnamed valley, No coordinates, no date. His unit was ordered to secure a group of civilians supposedly linked to insurgents. But when they arrived, there were no weapons, no defenses, just a cluster of families huddled near burned-out vehicles. He said they were told to wait for extraction, but no one came. Hours passed, and the radio stayed silent. Then, without command, half his squad vanished into the dark. Elliot's eyes drifted toward the corner of the room as he talked, like he was tracking something only he could see. His breathing got uneven, and his tone lowered almost to a whisper. He said the people they were guarding didn't speak, didn't move much, and didn't seem afraid. One of the civilians, a woman in a torn blue scarf, kept looking past them, over their shoulders, as if waiting for someone else to arrive. He said when dawn came, the sun hit the valley wrong. The ground looked black like wet glass, and none of the missing soldiers were ever found. I remember trying to ask clarifying questions, to keep the session professional, but the words stuck. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, charged. He rubbed his temples and said that later, during roll call, they'd still heard voices answering back, names belonging to those who'd disappeared. He laughed nervously and said he still hears them sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep. Then he went silent, staring down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, and his nails dug into his palms until I thought he might break the skin. I stopped the camera for a minute and asked if he wanted to take a break. He didn't respond, just sat there, breathing slow, eyes darting from the window to the wall behind me. After a while, he said something I couldn't make sense of, that the faces he saw back then still reported in, like they were waiting for orders. I turned the camera back on, but he seemed distant now, detached from the present. His words came fragmented, disjointed, half-sentences swallowed by long pauses. Then, all at once, he leaned forward and whispered, "They still think it's nighttime." His voice cracked when he said it. I tried to ask what he meant, but before I could finish, he stood up and walked out of frame. The door didn't close. It just creaked slowly until the room was empty on screen. I thought maybe he needed air, so I gave him a minute. When I finally stepped into the hall, there was no sign of him. His jacket still hung on the chair, his folder on the table, but the corridor outside was completely empty. Security searched the building, every office and stairwell, but no one saw him leave. The entrance camera never picked him up either. It was as if he'd vanished between frames. I filed a report, filled out every box I could, and left a note on the archive log explaining that the interview had ended abruptly. The rest of that evening is a blur. I remember locking the storage room myself, sealing the tape, and trying to convince myself that he'd just walked out quietly and slipped past the cameras somehow. A few days later, I came back to process the footage. The file was still labeled Marsh, Elliot, Interview A. It played normally at first, and the introductions, the small talk, everything exactly as I remembered. Then right where he leaned forward and whispered that last sentence, the image warped. His face blurred, and the sound distorted into static. The recording cut off mid-word. After that, there was a few seconds of darkness, and then a slow, rhythmic breathing close to the mic. Not his voice, not mine. I checked the system logs thinking maybe someone tampered with the file, but there was no sign of access. The room had been locked since that day. The tape was supposed to be stored offline, but somehow it showed a new timestamp. The night before I reviewed it. I didn't tell anyone. I just made a copy of the footage and kept it hidden at home, unsure if I'd ever be able to explain it. Every few months, the archive asks if I want to resume interviews, and I always find a reason to decline. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I play that last section with the volume all the way up. You can hear faint voices under the breathing. Quiet, clipped, like names being called one after another. I've compared them to his transcript. They match the names of the soldiers he said were gone. The original file is still stored in the project's cold archive, labeled as incomplete, but I've stopped checking it. Some stories, I think, aren't meant to be preserved. I'd been driving cross-country for work that summer. doing maintenance checks on comms equipment for different army bases. Most nights I slept in the truck, but that day had been long and brutally hot, so when I saw a flickering vacancy sign near the edge of a small base town, I decided to stop. The place was called the Pines Motel, though there weren't any pine trees anywhere nearby, just scrub grass and a cracked parking lot. The guy at the counter looked like he'd been carved out of old leather, buzz cut and sunburned cheeks, the kind of posture that doesn't go away even after you hang up the uniform. He introduced himself as Rick, said he used to be military police back in his day. "I give discounts to anyone who's ever worn a patch," he joked, tapping the counter with a grin. His stories came quick, about patrols overseas, long deployments, and kids these days who didn't know what discipline was. He seemed harmless enough, maybe a little too eager to talk, but I'd met plenty of retired guys like him. I signed the logbook, got my key, and headed to room 4, the one closest to the end of the row. The room smelled faintly of bleach and air freshener, but it was clean. Old floral curtains, buzzing neon leaking through the window, a TV bolted to the dresser with a cracked remote. I showered, grabbed a soda from the vending machine outside, and sat out front on one of the plastic chairs while the sun went down. Rick came by again, carrying a clipboard, and started chatting about how he liked to keep an eye on things, since the base traffic kept the area busy. He asked what kind of work I did, where I was headed, and whether I'd been stationed nearby before. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on my truck longer than seemed normal. Later that night, around 11, I noticed something strange. From the bed, I could see a faint red light blinking near the vent above the door. At first, I figured it was a smoke detector, but when I stood on the chair to check, it looked more like a small lens embedded into the plastic grill. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an old security sensor. But the idea stuck in my head, heavy and uneasy. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Rick was already outside sweeping the walkway when I stepped out. He greeted me like we were old friends, offered coffee from a thermos, and asked if I'd slept all right. I lied and said I had. He mentioned he was running the place mostly for the boys passing through, meaning soldiers from the nearby base who needed a cheap night between transfers. He even bragged about keeping the rates lower than the chains in town, because they deserve a break. It all sounded generous on the surface, but something about how rehearsed it felt made me uneasy. While packing my gear, I noticed faint scratches around the base of the mirror near the bathroom door, like someone had tried to pry it off with a screwdriver. Behind it, there was a subtle hum, mechanical, low, almost like wiring behind the wall. I leaned closer but stopped when the front door creaked open. Rick stood there holding a towel, smiling. Said he was just checking if I needed extras for the road. I thanked him and locked the door as soon as he left. The hum behind the mirror seemed louder after that. I checked out around 10, drove to a diner near the highway, and couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something. When the waitress asked where I'd stayed, I mentioned the Pines. Her face went still. She said she thought that place had shut down months ago. Claimed the property had been condemned for code violations. No running water, electrical hazards, the works. But I'd just been there less than an hour earlier. When I insisted it was open, she just stared at me and said, "Honey, nobody's supposed to be living out there." I called the local sheriff's office that afternoon to ask about it, figuring maybe Rick was running it off the books. The deputy on the line asked for my name and told me to stay where I was. Within 30 minutes, 2 officers showed up at the diner, took my statement, and asked me to describe the man. When I said his name was Rick, one of them exchanged a look with the other. They didn't tell me much, just that they'd been looking for him for a while. They asked if I still had my room key. I did, and they took it as evidence. 2 days later, an investigator called to follow up. He said they'd gone to the property early that morning and found the entire motel empty. Doors unlocked, office ransacked, lights still on. The basement door had been forced open, and inside were signs of something worse. There were faint blood traces along the drain and wiring that ran from the ceiling, down through a mess of disconnected monitors. Every guest room had hidden cameras disguised as vents, mirrors, even wall hooks. Most of them were wired to a central system in the basement. The man I'd met, Rick, was gone. The investigator explained that several missing soldiers had last been traced to the same stretch of road over the past year. Most were young, just traveling through between assignments. Their names showed up in the motel's handwritten logbook, the same one I'd signed. When authorities compared it with records from nearby bases, none of those men had ever checked in at their next destinations. Rick's real name wasn't Rick at all. It belonged to a retired military police officer who'd left service under investigation for misconduct years earlier. They suspected he'd been luring young servicemen by offering discounts, then drugging them. What happened after, nobody could say for sure. The blood evidence was partial, not enough for confirmation, and there were no bodies, only fragments of uniforms, scraps of tape, and boot soles buried behind the property. The agent told me they believed he'd fled the state within hours of me leaving that morning. My report was the last confirmed encounter anyone had with him. It's been years since then, and I still think about that night every time I pass a small roadside motel. I keep wondering how many people smiled back at that same man, handed him cash, and went to sleep under those same vents. Sometimes I wake up on the road and glance around, half expecting to see that faint red light blinking somewhere in the dark. I never stayed at another mom-and-pop place again, not after the Pines. Some things you can't unsee, even if you only saw them once.